Good morning. Welcome to class together today. Due to the time frame, we have about 3 weeks before we start our next 13-week study. And so I thought it would be good to tackle a subject that we tend to avoid, especially through our daily Bible reading. You may be reading through the Bible this year, and you may come to this point in your life where things get hard. For most, they start in January reading the book of Genesis. And it's interesting because you get to hear the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And then you come to Exodus, and Exodus has this wonderful sense of miracle and plague and Moses' leadership. But when you get to this time of the year, that's when a lot of people say, I got to quit. The reason is they run into the concept of sacrifice in the book of Leviticus. So, if I were to ask you, what do you think about Leviticus and about the whole idea of sacrifices? For most people, they'll answer something like this. It's tedious. It's irrelevant. I don't do that. It's complicated. It's confusing. I don't understand why God would do that and what they needed to do. And it's just page after page after page of talking about sacrifices. And that's why when we read through the Bible, we'll usually read until we get to Leviticus. We don't understand that book. We don't understand the concept of sacrifice. It doesn't make sense to modern people. We understand the lessons of Abraham or of Joseph or of Moses or the Ten Commandments or the Exodus. We witness the power of God in magnificent ways in those books. And yet, when we get to sacrifices, it gets a little overwhelming with regulations that buries the eternal in the regulatory. And I think there's some good reasons for our feelings. The first is our culture is different. Most sacrifices come from the backdrop of the ancient world. Much sacrifice is based upon the agriculture and the small farm. We don't have much of that in the city. We don't have much of that in the suburbs. We don't have much of that anymore on the farms, for that matter. But the second is our practice is different. I never grew up seeing a physical altar. Did you? I haven't witnessed the butchering of a lamb so it could be divided and burned on a pile of rocks while something is said. Instead, we come into churches where sacrifice tends to become something what we would say is metaphorical, not physical. And so it doesn't connect with our experiences. And things that don't connect with our experiences, we have trouble with. But the thing is that the things we read about sacrifices are indeed complicated. There are things like grain offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings and offerings for the birth of a child or the ordination of priests. Some things are burned, some things are waved in front of the Lord. And they have to be done in specific ways without variation. And no wonder when we come to this concept, we're confused and confounded. This is not going to be a comprehensive study. I'm not going to be able to answer every question you might have, but it's more of an overview of why we should appreciate what the concept of sacrifice really is and what God wanted from them and from us. And with that said, we do have a preconceived notion that we want to address in today's lesson. We believe that sacrifices were exclusive to the law of Moses. Since we get to Leviticus, we assume that's the totality of sacrifice. And it's true that Moses in the law codifies the rules and laws concerning sacrifices that the covenant demanded. However, there's more to sacrifice than just the Levitical code. In fact, as we'll see in today's lesson, and the third lesson, in fact, the concept of sacrifice goes on before the Red Sea and on the other side of the cross. But we have this notion, I think, for a good reason. Paul would write to the Colossians, Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities, and having put them to open shame by triumphing over them. And he talks about nailing the law to the cross. And so he said, let no one pass judgment on you about questions of food or drink, or regard to festival or new moon or Sabbath. Those are things that we know of. You see, that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross. We don't keep it anymore. The requirements of the ritual festivals and the legalistic keeping of the Sabbath was taken away. And yet many of the concepts kind of remain, including prohibitions about idolatry and murder and theft. It's against the backdrop of the sacrificial system of Leviticus, and especially the Day of Atonement, which is part of next week's lesson that we're going to look at. The Hebrew writer gives the reason Jesus had to die. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purity of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purifying our conscience from the dead works to serve the living God. The death of Christ was the eternal image of a physical sacrifice that was once made. And not only did Christ die on the cross, it was for the ultimate reason of salvation from sin. And even though sacrifice in the Old Testament touched on that, there was no amount of earthly sacrifice that could accomplish what God eventually wanted to accomplish. But because of these last two passages, we conclude that we shouldn't be concerned about sacrifices. That's part of the old law. That's done, one and done. It's over now. We don't have to think about that. And in a sense, that's true, but in a sense, it's insufficient. You see, we have three ages of time portrayed in the Bible. There's the patriarchal age, the time when the fathers spoke. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And then you have the Mosaic age in which God spoke to people through a law. And you have the Christian age, which we now live in, which is now the age of revelation, of Jesus coming and showing what God was like and what God wants us to do. And we assume, though, that the sacrifice belongs squarely in the time of Moses and the intervening period before Jesus. But hopefully, by the time we arrive at Lesson 3, you'll see how important the concept of sacrifice is in the New Testament, not just the law of Moses. But first, let's get a few details straight. When we encounter sacrifices, we find three things spoken in connection with them. The first is offering. It's the animal that's placed on the altar or the grain that's brought to the priest. We tend to use that as a synonymous with sacrifice in general. But the second is sacrifice. Now that can be either a noun or a verb. It could refer to what is being sacrificed, or it could be the act of giving the sacrifice. For the purpose of this lesson, sacrifice is what you're going to do with the offering. It is not limited and not universally applied, but for our purposes, that will suffice. But the final is the concept of the altar. It is the place of sacrifice. Yet many times when the term altar appears, it becomes an all-encompassing term for both what is sacrificed and the process of giving it. So what exactly is sacrifice? Let me simplify it if I can, maybe over so, but I think this is good for our lessons. It is the voluntary giving up of something precious because of God and what He wants. We can see that's told in the story of David's life. David had numbered his troops for all the wrong reasons. And so punishment ensues, and David repents of his arrogance and begs the Lord to stop the pestilence taking the lives of the people. So the Lord says, go give a sacrifice. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 24, we read of this interplay that takes place. And Gad came to David and said to him, go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusites. So he goes to this place, the threshing floor of Araunah, a high hill where the wind could blow free and blow the chaff away from the grain. And there Araunah, who apparently his family goes back a long, long way, owned this piece of property. This would become the place the temple would be built. Today, that location is called the Dome of the Rock, an Islamic temple that sits in Jerusalem. It's also traditionally the place where Abraham was to have sacrificed Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. And so God directs him to this place. And David says, I want to buy this land from you. From you, Araunah, would you please sell it to me? But Araunah says, no. I'm going to give it to you as a gift. But David refuses for a reason. But the king said to Araunah, no, I will buy it from you for a price, I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God. That cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. It is something that has to be willingly given that costs you something to make it significant. If not, it becomes something else. Without the right attitude and the giving up, the sacrifice becomes an empty ritual. And we kind of see this. We see it. In fact, we see sacrifices in the Bible in the earliest accounts of mankind. In Genesis 4, after Adam and Eve were driven from the garden by sin, we read of Cain and Abel, their sons. We remember the story due to Cain's murder of his brother Abel, but what prompts us gets our attention today. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstborn of the flock and the fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry and his face fell. Now let me ask you a simple question. What prompted the sacrifice here? Did you hear a command from God to offer a sacrifice? Now, there are some who will fill in the silence with, well, surely God commanded it. And that may be true. But I think it's safest to say that the text did not speak. But we have interpreted the text to say that. It never does say directly that God told them to sacrifice. It could be he did, and we don't read about it. It could be it was inferred, but it's not spoken. And so we read of two different kinds of sacrifices here. Cain's was from the field since he was a farmer, but Abel's was a lamb because he was a shepherd. Both will become part of the Mosaic law, so God does not prefer one over the other. You will find grain offerings, and you'll also find blood offerings, both in the law of Moses. But what seems to be the trouble here is an attitude. From the surrounding context, Cain has a chip on his shoulder, an ego that is out of control. We don't know what was going through his mind, but we can kind of surmise something that may be going on. Was he mad because he had to give something he would rather have kept? Was it just a grudging gift? But one thing is clear. When the sacrifice is not given with the right heart, it's never going to be acceptable. Just the giving up of something doesn't make it good sacrifice. And that's a thread that we're going to tug on to the rest of this small study. But we also see sacrifice when you come to the life of Noah. After Noah built the ark and the flood destroyed all the living things, Noah and his family finally departed the ark after almost a year. And one of the first things he did was build an altar for sacrifice. Genesis 8 tells us this. Then Noah built an ark to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. There was this assumption, this expectation that this would be done. Here it is in a fresh new world with the aroma of sacrifice to God. And you come further down to the life of Abraham. You can see it in the life of Abraham as well. We see Abraham's sojourn and when he does, he dots the landscape wherever he goes with altars. He comes to Canaan in Genesis chapter 12, and we see the pattern begin to emerge. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Wherever Abraham goes, he builds an altar and he offers sacrifices. It seemed to be the pattern of his life. And the same thing happens later when Abraham moves on, this time to the oaks of Mamre. The text does say that he does not waste any time building an altar. So Abraham moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. And as the promise of God was given to Abraham, God passes it on to Isaac, his son, the son of promise. And he too follows the pattern of his father. He moves to avoid a conflict in Gerar, and he settles, and here's God's promises given to him. And the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am God, the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. But then he does what his father did. He builds an altar and calls on the name of the Lord. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well as well. Again, like father, like son, Jacob was sent to Mesopotamia to get a wife and comes back to Canaan with two and a herd of children. But he returns to the promised land under the threat of Esau's vengeance for cheating him out of the birthright. He comes to the ancestral lands in Bethel, where again he builds an altar. And God said to Jacob, arise and go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. And Jacob set up a pillar in that place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. Now that same practice extends to the very final chapters of the patriarchal age as well. When Moses had fled to Egypt to escape punishment for killing an Egyptian taskmaster, there he spends 40 years tending sheep. One day, God speaks to him from a bush that's aflame but not being consumed. But God gives him a command to go back to Pharaoh. But Moses is reluctant, thinking no one will listen to him. But God directs a specific message to Pharaoh. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders will go to the king of Egypt and say, the Lord, the God of Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Here we see God directing sacrifice, not so much as a command to do it, but what seems to be an axle around which Israel's faith will revolve. But this whole scene sets up a seismic shift in the lives of Israel. So we have seen sacrifices that predate the law of Moses. It all occurred at the beginning and flowed through the lives of all the patriarchs. And we haven't even gotten to the 10 Commandments yet, much less the whole law of Moses. So what conclusions can you draw? Well, let's start with some. And I think these are going to help us as we understand going forward some of the other concepts when we get to Leviticus and even to the Christian age. First, sacrifice was a reality. It happened, even though we don't even read a command to do it. Much of the text is silent about God commanding sacrifices in the period of the patriarchs. Much of it has the feel of a human response to a sense of awe in God. I think it's important for us today to realize that sacrifice is prompted by more than a command or an ought, should, or must. If that's all it is, well, Mabel, it's time to go down the temple and give that sacrifice again. I wish we didn't have to, but I guess we'll just bite the bullet and do it. That's not exactly the tenor of all of these things that's being said. There seems to be something greater than that. And that's because that sacrifice takes place in the lives of those to whom the Lord speaks. Now, even though pagans sacrificed, their sacrifices were not for the same reasons. They were not born of a living God who spoke to them, who directed them, who they had faith in, but a superstitious groping in the spiritual dark. Theirs was not entirely the same. It might have looked the same, but it wasn't the same. But think about what we've learned through the patriarchs. These men heard the voice of God. These are people who are listening to God speak and following God's direction. And in response, a habit of life develops of bowing down before him and offering of their lives and of their lives, the things that they have raised, their livelihoods, the things that they would eat. These are things that would be given to God. And they all arise on the fact that I have heard the voice of God and I am responding to that in faith and obedience. And that's something that shouldn't be lost on us in these lessons. But why? I believe that people sacrificed because they knew God was greater than they were. One of the great triggers of sacrifice is understanding the very nature of God. If He is all powerful, loving, responsive, if He guides and cares for us, and that drives us to pour out our lives to Him. And I think the contrast between Cain and Abel is absolutely dramatic. Cain wants to run his own life. He's full of anger. He's full of hate. And he wants to do everything without God's interference. And we see how a heart like that ends up treating God. But we also see sacrifice as an expression of dependence, gratitude, and awe. I just want you to think about the patriarchs for a moment. Noah, coming out of the ark, he makes a sacrifice to God for what God has done for him and his family. There's a salvation moment. They're not the same as in Christ. But it is a powerful moment in which he sees blue skies and without rain and grass beginning to green. And he just falls to his knees and says, we've got a sacrifice today. Abraham made a journey of 1,000 miles to a land he'd never seen, only holding on to a handful of promises that wouldn't even be fulfilled in his lifetime. So God protects and leads him. And in response to God's graciousness in his life, he takes the time in every place to mark it with sacrifice. Both Isaac and Jacob, on hearing the promises given, build altars when they sacrifice to God. So the burning question is that we will look to answer a question: what place does sacrifice have in our lives today, not just in Leviticus? But first, next week, we're going to have to sort out all those laws in the book of Leviticus and get a handle on what God is thinking about sacrifice, because his thinking is what drives us today as well. But I am glad that you joined me for this lesson, and I look forward to our next lesson together, and I hope you will too. So until then, have a great day.